All right, good afternoon. Welcome again. As promised, we have our guest here to present the Progress on Sustainable Development Goals Agenda Snapshot. Sitting in the middle is Anita Bhatia, the Assistant Secretary-General and UN Women's Deputy Executive Director. On her right is Maria Francesca Spatolisano, the Assistant Secretary-General in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And on her left is Katie Tobin, the Senior Program Manager for Women's Environment Development Organization. Anita, please, you have the floor.
Thank you Thank you very much, Stefan. Today we are very proud to launch with our partner UN DESA and with partners from civil society our newest joint report on the status of women entitled Progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Gender Snapshot. The report is the only one within the UN system to take a gendered approach to the assessment of progress across all SDGs. And there is some really interesting data coming out of this report. So let me give you some of the highlights. First of all, this year's edition shows that at the current rate of progress, the achievement of all SDG 5 targets will take decades, maybe even centuries, to materialize. So here are some of the most important data points. It may take up to 286 years, almost 3 centuries, for women to have the same legal rights and protections as men. Second, parity in the workforce will not be achieved for 140 years. Third, it is likely to take 40 years to achieve equal representation in parliaments worldwide. And finally, if we want to eradicate child marriage by 2030, progress is going to have to be 17 times faster than it has been in the last decade, with obviously the biggest impacts being on women in rural, poor, and conflict-affected areas. In other areas also, this report shows that progress on poverty reduction for women and girls is facing acute challenges. By the end of 2022, around 383 million women and girls will be living in extreme poverty, less than $1.9 a day, compared to 386 million men and boys. And the report shows that there are several factors diminishing an already grim outlook for gender equality. We know already that the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath, conflict, and the backlash against women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as the food, finance, and fuel crisis worldwide, is having tremendously negative impacts on women. So we estimate that women have lost about 800 billion in income in 2020 due to the pandemic, and that despite a rebound in some parts of the world, their participation in labor markets is actually going to be lower in 2022 than it was pre-pandemic. And so it's true that many countries had a lot of social protection measures during COVID-19, but most of these measures were short-term measures and they were mostly gender blind. And countries, we know, barely had a chance to recover from the pandemic before the war in Ukraine erupted, and this limited supplies, of course, of wheat, fertilizer, fuel, propelled inflation. So as a result, many women and girls today are also going hungry in unprecedented numbers. Currently, we estimate 1.7 billion women and girls lack sufficient income to meet basic needs, such as food, clothing, and shelter. And extreme climate events around the world, including floods and droughts, are exacerbating food insecurity. And so, with less access to land, to education, to information, to resources, women are definitely the worst affected by such catastrophes. Data point here, the gender gap in food insecurity has increased from nearly 2 to over 4 percentage points between 2019 and 2021. Let me conclude then by pointing out that over 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, while schools around the world have largely reopened, the impacts on girls' education and learning remains. And nearly 130 million girls are out of school globally. More on this in the report. And finally, let me just say that given that the number of women and girls living in fragile and conflict-affected states is almost double the number in 2019 at 511 million, it's no surprise that women today report feeling less safe than they did even just a year ago, and they feel that their health, and we know their health and well-being has deteriorated. So a lot of sort of gloomy news there, but I think what the report also does is that it puts into perspective the work that remains to happen, and the fact that gender inequality cannot be allowed to continue to flourish, and that we owe it to our daughters, granddaughters, sons, and grandsons to bring about a new and better world. And for that, we need stronger international cooperation, much more financing, the public and the private sector to step up together, because only through a stronger multilateral, multi-stakeholder approach can we put women's and girls' equality back on track. Thank you.
Thank you. Francesca?
Thank you, and good afternoon. And I'm very happy to join everyone here for the launch of this SDG Gender Snapshot 2022, which is jointly produced, as Anita said, by UN DESA and UN Women. And we are, as you know, in the midst of multiple and interconnected crises predominated by, just to name the worst, COVID-19, conflict in Ukraine, climate change and other conflicts, and climate change. And these crises and their complex interactions, of course, they have impacts on all our basic needs: food and nutrition, health, education, the environment, peace and security. And this way, they halt or reverse years and sometimes decades of progress in development. So gender equality, this is the point I want to make, is the foundation for achieving all the SDGs, and it should be at the heart of building back better. This gender snapshot shows that women and girls and other vulnerable populations are bearing the brunt of the devastating social and economic fallout. Women and girls are struggling against this disproportionate share of job losses, as Anita was saying, increased care work at home, derailed schooling, intensified risk of domestic violence, and other forms of exploitation. On the other hand, women have played a central role in the response to COVID-19. They were frontline health workers, care providers, managers, and leaders of recovery efforts, and yet they remain underrepresented in leadership positions, and their rights and priorities are mostly not explicitly addressed in the measures to respond to this crisis. So we really need to turn this around. And we know that investment in women, in their education, employment, rights, and reproductive future pays dividends. We know that, and addresses many interconnected SDGs. Decades of research have shown the impacts that investment and empowerment of women and girls can have, yielding positive outcomes across the various sustainable development objectives. For instance, education. Girls' rights to education are integral to virtually every aspect of development, because a more educated woman, girl, will help contribute to faster poverty reduction, better maternal health, lower child mortality, greater HIV prevention, reduced violence against women. And did you know that each additional year of schooling can boost a girl's earnings as an adult by up to 20%? Also, ensuring the rights of women and girls across the goals translates into more just societies, inclusive economies, and more prosperous and sustainable environments. And so, simply put, the SDGs are not achieved without achieving gender equality and women's empowerment. But we cannot, and this is my second point about data, we cannot develop the types of policies, programs, and plans needed to address these challenges without first knowing how they are impacted. Today, halfway through the implementation of the SDGs, more than half of the data required to monitor Goal 5 are still not available. As a result, a global progress level assessment is only available for 13 out of 18 indicators, and a global trend assessment for a mere 3 indicators. This means that as we approach the midpoint of the 2030 Agenda, we lack the information on whether or not we have made progress since 2015 for the vast majority of indicators. The gender snapshot can only provide a glimpse of where we are and where we are coming short, and based on the data we know, we can say some things. However, there are a number of areas, such as overall progress on ownership, or secure rights over agricultural land, that we cannot shine a light on due to the lack of quality gender data. And where data are missing, women and girls are invisible, left behind. Funding, therefore, as Anita said, for statistical development, including the most especially for inclusive data and disaggregated data by sex, must be a priority for national governments and the international community if we want to emerge stronger from these challenging times. And the global community developed the SDGs as a blueprint, and they remain the roadmap to tackle the challenges. But global cooperation and investment in gender equality, women empowerment agenda will be key to ensure we can get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Katie?
Thank you. So as we've just heard, this year's SDG Gender Snapshot reveals utterly dire projections about women and girls' continued subjugation and poverty. As our ASGs have indicated, things are getting worse, not better. And for the environmentally focused SDGs, 12 to 15, we don't even know the exact impact on women, girls, and gender diverse people. These 4 SDGs together have just one gender-specific indicator and take up just 1 page of the report. So we do know, and the report acknowledges, that women and girls, especially across the global south, are significantly and disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis and environmental destruction. And this disadvantage is not coincidental, but is rooted in systemic discrimination and structural inequalities. But what we aren't yet able to measure, as we just heard, is exactly how, at a global level, gender determines the impact of disasters, of climate crisis, or of increasing ecological destruction. So given these data gaps that exist, we're also not able to indicate the flip side, how that kind of broad-scale quantitative analysis that our political systems prefer can show us how advancing gender equality contributes to better climate action or to disaster risk reduction policy and response. So we need more disaggregated, intersectional, locally specific data at the nexus of gender and environment in particular to help advance the kind of action and policy we need to see. So I'll really quickly mention just 2 priorities of the feminist movement for climate justice in this regard. And the first is recognizing and redressing loss and damage. So loss and damage being the destruction, the unequal climate-related impacts that happen beyond any attempts to adapt, and that we know disproportionately affect the most marginalized, including especially women. And we need to do this by supporting the demands of global South countries and civil society for a specific financing facility, and for that funding to come from the rich countries who industrialized at the expense of those now on the front lines. But data is also a huge part of this piece in terms of addressing loss and damage in a meaningful and equitable way. We have to understand how gender and other factors determine differences and disproportionate impact. And at the same time, we need to look at the prevention side, the role of the state in providing, for example, the kinds of universal public services that are so key to gender equality, especially in the context of increasing climate crisis and destruction. So this year's Gender Snapshot shows, for example, the urgency around water and sanitation, with 800,000 women and girls dying every year because of lack of access to these services. And we know that this is only going to get worse with increased water stress and scarcity due to climate change, and that means a direct impact on the increasing household responsibilities of women and girls, and on their health, time, education, livelihoods, and right to leisure, and on their continued, subsidizing of the failure of the state to provide these services. So this is just one example of how we need that data to understand the root causes of gender inequalities and able to enable us to shape policy that addresses it. And data is also important as a vehicle for women's leadership and participation, including in through modes such as feminist participatory action research. So to conclude, I'll just mention one new alliance that's been set up to address this, to kind of fill the gender and environment data gap, which is called the Gender and Environment Data Alliance. And we do, and IUCN are co-coordinating it on behalf of 15 founding partners, including UN Women. And the goal is to address this exact issue, to improve accessibility, availability, understanding, and use of data and information on gender and the environment. And we're kicking off the initiative this year at the UN General Assembly. And we really see this as one step towards kind of filling this gap that we've talked about today to achieve gender transformative and evidence-based climate and environment policy. So this year's report, the SDG Gender Snapshot, and what it leaves out, really makes clear the need for better and more extensive data and information. And only through a holistic approach that looks at climate and gender and economic justice together, guided by intersectional and disaggregated data, will we be able to collectively address the root causes of the interconnected crises that we face. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katie. Edie?
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. First, a follow-up question on the data gap. So exactly how many countries were actually included in the gender snapshot, and what issues did you have enough data to make your projections? And I'm especially taken by making projections, for 286 years. That's a long way off, and heaven knows what the world's going to be like then. That seems a little far-fetched to me, quite frankly. And secondly, on the issue, probably more importantly, of trying to get gender equality back on track and the need for additional funding, political will, policy support, in a world where there is tremendous competition for funding at this moment, how do you see this issue getting perhaps the amount of funding it deserves? Thank you.
Thank you. Who?
Now, about the data, in this snapshot at the end, we have produced these tables which show where data are available and where there is the gap. And there are 4 or 5 of these pages, one by one, listed according to each target and indicator that we have covered. So that will give you an idea where we have data and where we don't. We have only, if you want, produced data aggregated at the regional level, not country by country in this snapshot. And of course, there are differences in the regions, and these are also reported in this table. So the projections are based, as I said, on what we know, but of course there are many things we don't know, and that's the point I'm making. We advocate for more disaggregated data to be more granular, more able to give the right picture. On the funding?
Yeah, First, I think it's a great question because you are right. There is a huge competition for resources right now, and that competition isn't going to go away anytime soon. So I think the work really has to be to have empirical research which shows that investing in gender equality actually has a positive impact on solving other crises. So, for instance, if you take a gender lens on the food security issue and you really think about how women are affected by the food security and hunger crisis, then you will likely have public policies that have beneficial impacts for all of society, not just for women. That's just one example. So I think the real work is continued advocacy to show the benefits of investing in women as having effects not just on women, but on their families, communities, and society as a whole.
Thank you. James? And then
James Bays, Al Jazeera. Your findings are quite shocking and depressing. So what is the message to the world's political leadership as you're going to have them all right here in 2 weeks' time?
The message to the world's political leadership is that there really is a need for urgent action on the gender equality agenda, precisely because the data are so depressing. But second, that, again, just in line with what I said before, that investing in gender equality actually has positive outcomes on many of the other crises that policymakers are trying to solve. So it is not just the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do.
thank you. Linda Fasulo?
Thank you, Steph. I have just an overall question. Over the years, the issue of women's access to family planning has been highlighted. And as we know, in developed countries, women have fewer children. 2 is the norm. And of course, education levels are much higher, which leads to access to the labor force and ability to live more independently. Consequently, over the years, how much has the fertility decreased? In other words, it's been discussed that women should have good access to family planning in the poorest countries, and this, of course, will have an impact on population growth around the world. So it seems that this has gotten lost in the whole cycle of what to do, how to help women, because it seems like a very basic approach. And is it being ignored? Are you disappointed with the levels of particularly government attention?
I don't have data on fertility declines, do you, Maria Francesca, on what the numbers are? But I think, I think the broader issue on family planning today is on sexual and reproductive rights. And that's where the focus needs to be, because in many countries across the world, both developed and developing, we're seeing pushback against rights, and women are losing access to actually family planning services. So that is actually the key issue to focus on today.
Thank
But
you.
have fertility rates decreased? Like in Africa, for example, we knew it was like eight children per woman, and then I think it was reduced to 6.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, clearly those numbers, there was an interest in reducing those numbers to allow women to, secure a better life for themselves and, of course, for their children. So I'm just saying, in other words, we discussed reproductive rights, but this seems like a basic no-brainer to make sure.
Thank you. I think there's some audio open. If you could close it. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a colleague in the room who might have some data on this.
Maybe we'll share that. Yeah, we'll share that. Ibtisam Azam?
Hi, thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I have a few follow-ups. So you talked about the challenges you have in regarding data. Could you elaborate why which kind of challenges you are having? Is it because governments are not providing you with that data, or do you have also, how do you get the data? Is it also through NGOs and not only government?
The statistical department, which is housed in DESA, is a very well-established and complex operation, and we have quality standards and methodologies and all sorts of ways of operating which are decided by the statistical offices of the member states collectively, etc. All this system is in place to collect data which are provided by the national governments, of course. And the national governments, sometimes they have the capacity, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have decided to pursue a certain disaggregated policy by sex, policy. Sometimes they don't. And that is the source of the data. Besides, in the last few years, to be honest, through the pandemic, of course, the collection of data was very difficult because you can't send people around, through a pandemic to make surveys and collect the data in some cases. So some systems are more informatic-oriented than others. There is a vast number of reasons why collection of data is a challenge. And in addition, you have to put this need for disaggregated data that we advocate for is a relatively recent one. So far, disaggregated data were collected only for the very basic, information needed. How many men, how many women, and that was about it. So we are developing a new set of knowledge through these SDGs and SDG 5 in particular, but it requires a little time. And so we push for more awareness, more cooperation of governments to do so, and local governments as well. One of the things we don't have enough data, for instance, is how many women participate in local government. We have data for national parliaments, but not necessarily for other levels of government, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Unfortunately, sorry, go ahead, because we have the
Just one-
PGA
yeah,
waiting, but please go ahead.
So very
Sam.
quickly, you talked about urgent actions. And my question is, how do you want to bring these governments to take urgent actions? For example, even rich countries who were supposed to aid countries in the global south when it comes to environment and environmental problems. How do you want to do it? Because there is always the talk about urgent actions, but we see less really actions on the ground.
We need some people to be champions of this and step up and show how it can be done. And we hope that once that is done, others will follow. So you do need, again, to keep making the case that investing in gender equality is not a nice to have, but it is a smart thing to do, because investing in women, whether it's the care economy, whether it is in formalizing informal work, whether it is in getting them into more positions of power and representation, is going to have benefits that are economically visible, not in the long term, but actually in the short term. So that advocacy case has to continue, but we need some governments to step up and show how it can be done, and then others to be incentivized to follow. We basically need a race to the top on gender equality, not the race to the bottom that is happening right now.
Thank you.
Thank
Katie Tobin and our two Assistant Secretary Generals, thank you very much. And as you know, we have the President of the General Assembly waiting in the green room. Thank you.
Stefan, can I just say one thing
Of
that
course.
I just want to clarify, just so that it's clear, that the 3 centuries, the 286 years, is to close gaps in legal protection and remove discriminatory laws. So it's one aspect of gender equality. There are others like representation which have different numbers. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a lot too.
Thank you.